I welcome Mike Merrison, co-founder and COO for the EDM Council. Mike joined the EDM Council in 2015 to lead industry engagement, having been the co-founder and the first chairman of the council. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome to all of our EDM webinar participants for today. So why are we all here? As context, in March 2020, a year and a half ago, the EDM Council was approached by a group of companies to include Morgan Stanley, London Stock Exchange Group, and Google to consider forming an industry work group to build a cloud data management capabilities framework focused on establishing key controls for protecting sensitive data in the cloud, hybrid cloud, and multi-cloud. The EDM Council agreed to support this effort with the provision we could assemble a core group of companies representing industry to include other major cloud providers and more. To our surprise, in a few months, upwards of 100 companies came together to include 17 of the top 30 globally systemic important banks worldwide, the top 4 major CSPs, and many other major firms. And we embarked on a collective 1.5-year journey that included upwards of 300 participants, 750 meetings, 45,000 person hours, which equates to 25 people years, and to develop a release of the CDMC, which stands for the Cloud Data Management Capabilities Framework, which was published as a free license and available to all companies this September 2021. Capco played a special role in contributing to the overall CDMC project management, as well as providing subject matter experts throughout the year and a half. Today's EDM webinar is further advocated by Capco and carries today's discussion on the opportunity for all companies and how you can leverage CDMC for a clearer path to the cloud. So with no further ado, let me introduce Chris Probert, Capco partner and UK practice lead, to walk everyone through today's agenda. Chris?
Hey, Mike, thank you. First, before I go into the agenda, just to say how proud we are of the efforts we've played into the initiative. I think we believe it's a really important collaboration, and I think it's going to set the industry in good stead for the journey to cloud. But on today's agenda, there's a lot to get through, so we're going to finish off with the introductions. We want to talk to this group a little bit around the CDMC. I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but we want to make sure everyone on the call is familiar with the actual framework. We want to then move on to how does that framework help build solutions, or how can we use the CDMC framework to build out solutions? We want to then move on to how does this play a really interesting role with the regulators. I often refer to the CDM superpower as it's the ability to standardize conversations with the regulators, and I think it's an important point. And then we'll move on to a Q&A session. If I could ask everyone on the line, please don't be shy. Throw questions out there as we go along in the chat function. We will try and answer as many of them in the Q&A as possible, and as it was said at the front of the call, if we don't get time to cover any, we will provide written answers back to everyone who registered. So Mike, if I hand back to you for the next piece, thanks.
Sure, thank you, Chris. And now on to our panelists. And I think credit to everyone involved. This is an excellent group. Let me introduce first Andrew Foster. Andrew is with the Chief Data Office and is Head of Data Governance in the Americas for Deutsche Bank. So welcome, Andrew, to the panel. I'd also like to introduce Puneet Bhargava, who is the Chief Architect of Security Services Technology at Citi. I'd also like to introduce Jubair Patel, who is the Senior Cloud Solutions Architect at Microsoft, and also was the lead CDMC capabilities project executive during the year-and-a-half project. So welcome, Jubair. And in addition to Chris, I'd like to also introduce Russell DeKogan, who is the principal consultant for data architecture capability at the UK data practice in Capco. And of course, Chris, yourself as the partner of UK data practice in Capco. So welcome everyone to the panel. Russell, what I'd like to do is turn it now over to you to have you give a little more of a context of CDMC and this initiative.
Well, thanks, Mike. So at this stage, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what we'll cover today. So to kick it off, clearly the emergence of cloud computing has afforded firms that successfully exploit cloud with new sources of competitive advantage. Be that the opportunity to drive down costs or scale services up or down on demand, or distribute applications globally in short time scales. And business models have really evolved in response to that. And whilst no one would doubt that the adoption of cloud within financial services has been broadly positive, I guess we've had a lack of a fully comprehensive roadmap for cloud adoption and cloud assessment. Has created some divergence amongst firms in the industry in both the speed of adoption and manner in which adoption has been undertaken. And really the cloud data management capabilities framework has come into play, and it seeks to address this as a framework of capabilities, requirements, controls, and guidance for managing sensitive data in the cloud. So in our session today, we've brought together, as you can see, a select panel of industry thought leaders to help our audience gain a better understanding of it. And this includes the CDMC framework itself, building out solutions within CDMC, tooling with CDMC in financial services, and then really how engagement with both industry and regulatory bodies can be enhanced with this framework. So that's really what we want to cover today, and that is the basis of what we'll bring to life in our discussion. So without further ado, let's get into the detail and give a brief overview of the CDM framework itself. So CDMC really seeks to provide a framework that empowers companies to more effectively pursue and implement multi-jurisdictional cloud adoption strategies and best practice. And really, to respond to the original opportunity, we saw industry participants from across financial services and from cloud service providers and technology vendors initially approached the EDM Council to assemble an industry working group. And as a result, the CDMC framework was created, and that consists of 6 core components and 14 related capabilities, and no less than 37 sub-capabilities that really provide detailed guidance on protecting sensitive data in the cloud or hybrid cloud environment. And those capabilities, as you can see here, those components and capabilities include data governance and accountability. So that includes data ownership, data sourcing, and data sovereignty. Secondly, data cataloging and classification and their associated capabilities. Data accessibility and usage, which includes data entitlements and access tracking and usage of ethical data usage. And data protection, which includes the following capabilities of securing data and data privacy. Data lifecycle management, which includes both data profiling and data quality, and also data lifecycle management plan. And lastly, the data and technical architectural component, which I've had the pleasure of teaching already, which covers data provenance, data lineage, and technical design principles. So that kind of gives us a high-level summary of the framework and its components plus capabilities. But what about the benefits? So, what benefits might we expect to accrue in adopting this framework? Well, the focus of the framework is, of course, to mitigate several key cloud delivery challenges that we're seeing and that market participants regularly face. We know that financial institutions already operate under an increasingly complex and evolving regulatory regime, and as such, there is a need for a framework which banks can adhere to for data compliance and one that is audited for cloud implementation. And CDMC answers that need, or seeks to answer that need. And we also know that both cloud storage and data processing require both rigorous assessment to ensure compliance with data sovereignty laws as per the regulation, local territory law, and governance structure from the country within which that data is collected. But there are also cost considerations So data owners must be able to understand as to who is using what data, the frequency of data access, and the costs incurred in providing that data, rendering that data access. There are also security controls within the framework because a framework and guidance are required to help mitigate the risk of data loss and to ensure that appropriate security controls are in place for sensitive data and that they are consistently applied. So hence we see the notion here of always on controls. So CDMC also supports and provides guidance in the validation of the efficacy of data classification, data governance and data quality controls access data, regardless of source or purpose. And lastly, I think the point here is that the CDMC framework also aids in the implementation of data access and entitlements controls. So we know that uncontrolled data access can result in data leakage. As such, data entitlements must be both audited and automated to restrict and control access. And so with that in mind, I wanted to now turn to our panel and to bring in one of our panelists, Jubair. Welcome, Jubair. So I wanted to start by asking, how are providers responding? How are Microsoft responding to this best practice as articulated by the EDM Council and indeed the CDMC?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Russell. And Microsoft have been deeply embedded into the CDMC since its inception in March 2020. And as a result, we've heard firsthand the requirements for data governance from our customers that are moving onto the cloud. We completely recognize that the data governance requirements that are articulated in the CDMC aren't just a set of requirements to enable the best use of analytics and data in these modern environments, but they're actually to increase the adoption of cloud, to increase the accelerate the way that customers can move to cloud in heavily regulated industries. The questions that you posed around privacy, around security, around sovereignty, they aren't just things that will enable better use of our data. They're actually blockers to proper cloud migration. Until questions around those things can be answered, we can't move workload to the cloud as quickly as we'd like to. So as such, we're looking at the CDMC not just as an endpoint framework that we would say, okay, once all your data is into the cloud, this is how you modernize. We're building it into our cloud adoption framework. That's something that we're looking to do as customers are actually measuring their journey to the cloud. How do you ensure that data moving to the cloud is ready to be moved and is governed correctly? Secondly, we have looked at the CDMC as an overall set of requirements for the tools we are developing and have developed in this space of data governance. And we recently announced our Purview data catalog solution is going into general availability for public consumption. So all customers of Microsoft Azure have access to the Purview data governance solution. And that will cover all of the capabilities covered in the CDMC. And at the moment has a very native Microsoft feel and is integrated into all of our services natively, and also gives multi-cloud interoperability to other services as well as hybrid services on-premise as well. So we've taken a very native and multi-cloud interoperable approach to how we respond to CDMC.
Thanks, Jubair. So that segues quite nicely into our next subject, which is building out solutions with CDMC. So with that in mind, it is, of course, the hope that market participants will take up the CDMC framework so to enhance their data management capabilities and thereby allow solutions to become more flexible and extensible. But this in turn will, I guess, impact how solutions are delivered. So really what I'm trying to get at here is as market participants assess their solutions, and cloud service provider tools and the accompanying tech vendor services. Those services will continue to evolve in response. It's hoped so to accommodate this best practice as defined by the EDM Council and CDMC. So therefore, as a company, as I build a solution, I now understand how products and services from the external markets, tech vendors and from CSPs will meet my needs in terms of CDMC attestation. So that's one point. But then in addition to certifying processes, operations, and automated controls against the CDMC framework, a firm's cloud capabilities can also be built out in conjunction with vendors who have themselves certified their own technology solution, their own products, that is, against the 14 key controls and automation opportunities. So, as a market participant, or as a bank, or as a financial services organization, I can now design for full front-to-back CDMC automation and assess or certify my solution against the CDMC controls, safe in the knowledge that the vendor tech I have selected has itself been accredited. So that really then underpins the solution I, as an FS organization, hope to bring to market, and creates, if you like, a virtuous circle. Moreover, with CDMC and its 12-monthly recertification cycle, which we can see here in the diagram, new offerings and features from solution providers will be assessed and reassessed against the 14 controls during recertification, thereby future-proofing my solutions. So what we're trying to get into is that virtuous cycle, and that CDMC supports that. So with that in mind, I wanted to again turn to our panel and to bring in our next panelist, Puneet. Hi, Puneet. So what are your thoughts in terms of solutionizing with CDMC as a market participant? How do you see it aiding solution delivery, particularly perhaps with your own sector of asset servicing? Your thoughts, please.
Sure. Russell, there are two key trends that we are observing in asset servicing industry, particularly front to back consolidation, bringing front office closer to middle office and back office, and then rise of what we call as shared data platforms, where all the different participants, third-party administrators, brokers, custodians, etc., can share a common data platform and eliminate the latencies and the data quality challenges associated to exchange of data. Now, CDMC framework, I think, is a huge enabler and accelerator to both of these transformation themes. The coverage of CDMC across 14 capabilities, 13 sub-capabilities, really give a comfort factor to the architects, to the developers, to the tech leads, that no aspect of the solutioning on the cloud is overseen or ignored. There's guidelines, there's cookbooks, and absolute great coverage in CDMC across all of these different aspects of solution development. I think the second aspect, which is a huge enabler, is the adherence of the common framework by different participants in the process of solutions delivery. The cloud service providers, vendors, the partners in terms of third-party administrators, etc. If all of them adhere and embrace this common standard, then interoperability of the data, the security, privacy, classification of the data, and just the management of the shared platform becomes so much easier. So I think as we embrace cloud in a more governed and accountable way, be able to tag the data and classify the data accordingly, identify the right usage of the data, right ownership of the data across the extended solutioning team, CDMC provides a great sort of framework where all these capabilities can coexist and work efficiently together.
Okay, Puneet, that's great to hear. So Mike, back to you now. I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you, Russell, and Puneet. Thank you for sharing your perspective on the framework. Also, to let everyone know that is in this webinar today, that if you'd like to see and utilize and read the CDMC framework, super easy, just go to the edmcouncil.org public website, click on the CDMC menu. It is a free license for all companies, all industries to download. The only thing you need to do is register. so that if there are any updates to that framework, we have the ability to contact you over time, which there'll be governance, there'll be additional releases as we get more market feedback. It's about 165 pages of advice across all of these areas. And again, it is a free license open to industry. And it's public service because so many companies were involved, both members and non-members of the council. We made a commitment with this large contribution of time that this should be a resource for everyone to utilize. So onto this slide, Russell, thank you for sharing it. This gives a picture on one page of all of the different participants. On the far left, you'll see that the CDMC working group had a fantastic contribution from the financial industry and other leading providers. So as mentioned, 17 of the 30 top GSIBs worldwide, you'll see many of the logos here, and others participated. You'll see the column over for cloud and technology providers, in addition to Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, IBM Cloud, Snowflake, Calibra, Informatica, Big ID, DataWorld, Privitar. Many companies were involved. And notably for the large, these are the top 4 CSPs in revenue worldwide. It's somewhat unprecedented that they all came to the table because they certainly do compete in the market. And each put in a half a dozen or more engineers during the 1.5-year timeframe to build the framework across all of the capabilities that Russell, you've described, and Puneet, that you've been speaking to. We also have been asked, why did they do that? Or why did these companies come together? It's because the framework is a common industry requirements. It's the what to do for good data management, comprehensive management of risk data in the cloud. It does not specify how each company innovates their solution to meet those requirements. So that allowed companies that compete to be at the table to hear the common requirements of protecting sensitive data, and then an opportunity to engineer their solutions and automate as much of this as possible. That's why we had this incredible, unprecedented participation. In the third column, you'll see that under regulatory engagement, major financial regulators throughout the world, in the US, the Federal Reserve, the SEC, the CFTC, the FDIC, and others in Canada, OSFI in the UK, the Bank of England, the FCA, the ICO, and EU, the ECB, and ESMA, who we're pending discussions with, in Germany, BaFin, and so forth. Each of these organizations, we have made it our business to brief along the way in the development of CDMC. In fact, in the last 6 months, we've conducted multiple sessions with many of these organizations, and it's both their internal data management teams and their supervisory arms to brief them on the details of the controls of the framework and the value of a common point of view, and also to assure that it would meet cross-jurisdictional requirements for protecting sensitive data as defined in GDPR or CCPA and any of the other core jurisdictional regulations around protecting data. And then finally, in addition to building the core framework, in parallel, we were blessed to have a team of people within the CDMC work group help build training course materials, cloud certification programs, a partner network. And we also announced a week or two ago with the Linux Foundation that Finos, which is the financial open source foundation, and the EDM Council have partnered to make available testing scripts against the CDMC framework that'll be open source and available so companies can speed up their act of conducting assessments and certifications. All of this led again to the publication of the framework on the 28th of December. And since that release about a month ago, we've had thousands of downloads cross industry, certainly many coming from the financial markets and across all of the geographic sectors. So it is receiving very wide attention, but it is still in the early days. And that's why we're conducting, with the help of Capco and other key partners in the marketplace, these awareness seminars and webinars so that everyone can understand the value of this. And since it is a free license that can be used internally by your organization, how to derive the most value from it. So with this backdrop, Russell, I'd like to carry forward with inviting the panelists in And at this point, Andrew Foster, who's with Deutsche Bank, leads America's data governance. Andrew, here's a question for you, which is, what are your expectations of how the CDMC framework will impact industry engagement, especially when it comes to regulatory engagement? Andrew, I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Mike. So slightly off topic, but first of all, just anyone listening to this and thinking, how would I be engaged on this? Would I have anything to offer? I came into this a year ago knowing a lot about data governance and not knowing a lot about cloud, but it put me in a position to work with incredibly smart people and ask for perfection. So if you get one of these opportunities to engage with the EDM Council on similar initiatives, rather think about what you can bring from your own background as opposed to what maybe you don't have in the area of speciality. Overall, for myself, an incredibly powerful experience. If I look now at Mike's question, so a framework without adoption is an attractive diagram with sort of little other merit, right? It becomes an academic exercise. So the way I looked at this was all about language. On this call at the moment, we're all speaking English. We're fortunate to understand each other. And the CDMC is just another way of understanding each other across a specialized topic. So the moment you say phrases like 14 control points, just think about the discussion that you have with your internal audit function, right? And you don't just get to say 14 control points, you get to say 14 industry vetted control points that are now best practice, right? So how do I get to that point? Started looking the moment the CDMC framework was announced, who's latching onto it? Are vendors marking to market their own capabilities against what's on offer? What is the level of engagement with regulators? And I think to the diagram in front of us, and you can, you lurk around LinkedIn, you will see the vendors sort of pushing their wares and doing that mark to market. Certainly, I'm not part of any of the regulatory engagement there and couldn't speak on what the regulators are saying, but just what Mike's told us, I think you can see the value of that. So once again, you come back to that language. I think it's going to be easier to deliver common benefit. I think it's going to make it cheaper to deliver because you're not trying to create bespoke solutions every time. And I think in terms of trying to persuade your own internal organization that what you're doing is the right thing, you get to leverage the fact that the names under the CDMC working group, the names under the cloud and technology providers, they're household names and they're sort of the best in the business. So Mike, back onto your question, I think life gets easier. It's all about adoption. So if we come back and have this call a year from now, the key question will be, is it just built into delivery now? Is it just built into the cloud service providers offerings that as a matter of course, kind of like Jubair said earlier, they can say, this is where we cover the 14 control points that the CDMC recommends.
Awesome. And I'll open up to the other panelists if anyone would like to chime in on this question. Chris, do you want to add to it?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a really interesting paradigm here to think about the challenge of some items like transaction reporting a number of years ago, where in reality, organizations and the regulators are having lots of binary one-to-one conversations. I think this is a really good opportunity for us to kind of standardize that conversation of what does a good cloud look like? What does a good control framework look like? Which means that we're not going to run into the risk of any kind of arbitrage between different regulators or in worst case scenario, regulators picking the best of one solution and the best of another and then trying everyone to kind of escalate to the top. So I think that's going to be a really important part of standardizing that communication, which for me, and I said at the beginning, I think is almost could be seen slightly as almost like a little superpower of the CDMC framework.
Now, Chris, I like that statement of the superpower. I wanted to share a quick story for everyone listening in, that as we started to brief the regulators that you see on this list, we actually had some really interesting contributions. Some of you may be aware that in July, we made our first publication before the full framework, and it was the 14 key controls and automations for protecting sensitive data in cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. And those 14 controls were published intentionally by this group to allow companies, and especially the cloud and technology providers, to have a target of, in their product management playbook, in their offerings, that if they can engineer these capabilities through their direct and partner offerings, this would be a way to speed up the market, because then these 14 controls could be evidenced as being turned on. When we actually started to present this about four months ago to regulators, it was 12 controls, not 14. And it was actually a couple of the regulators on this list that said, we do see these 12 controls. They will protect the ability to track data across jurisdiction, but there's 2 controls we believe should be added. Number 1 is a control specifically to track cross-border movement of data, which is a core, as you know, when you look at data privacy legislation like GDPR, that is a requirement. And number 2, you should have a Uber control, a control that makes sure all other 13 controls are operating and transparently documenting and transcribing any of the net changes and alerting in the event that any control is not operating. These controls are meant to be always on, always protecting sensitive data. So in fact, that feedback with regulators really made a difference to add to this framework, because it gave that extra lens of their point of view. Many of these, by the way, at least 2/3 to 3/4 are active members with the EDM Council. They've been active users of the DCAM framework, et cetera. So really a useful capability. So now on to the, some basic audience questions. Russell, if good with you, I'm gonna carry on to a few right now, and Chris, and throw them out to the group. First, there's a question here from Mario on when will these recordings be available? Shortly after, within the next, I think, few hours after the conclusion of this event, there will be an automated distribution to everyone that registered. So you'll get the recording, and we encourage you to watch it. And you also have the right to share it to anyone in your company or any friend in the market. This is a public service, and thanks to Capco for sponsoring this, so that you can share it freely with anyone else if you'd like to do that. The second question, and I'll open it up to Joubert and team at this point, which is related to, will there be mass, and this is from Mario, mass partner certifications? And I think, Joubert, it might be helpful if you want to point to the fact that we sort of see 2 different types of certifications and assessments in the market. Do you want to comment on that, Joubert, and just welcome your thoughts on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 2 certifications we've developed through the CDMC go to, actually, I think they're 3, but they're the 2 that are aimed at partners would be the assessment of the technology and certifying technology that provides these solutions or provides these capabilities. So any of the data catalogs or technology providers that were involved in the CDMC will have the opportunity to effectively assess themselves against the core controls that were released as part of that document that Mike mentioned, the core 14 controls. And KPMG have released a test specification, and that can be run against the catalogs that the providers are offering. And we can effectively put our hands up and say, hey, we can meet 14 out of 14 or however many of the capabilities that we as a provider offer against the standard defined in the CDMC. And that would be a fantastic badge for companies that are offering these solutions to the industry, for them to hold up and say, if you come to a solution or if you take a solution that we offer, you get the capabilities for free. And then also you get the other side of the certification, which is, as a bank or a financial services institution that has a solution that you want to check is CDMC compliant, you can then assess yourself against the same framework and say, how does our solution, our implementation of a technology and the organization around it, the process and people around it, how does that meet the CDMC standard? I'm sure many on the call will be familiar with DCAM. I think there was a question in the Q&A around DCAM as well. We have a very similar maturity assessment model in CDMC as with DCAM. And obviously we all know the approach to go and become certified in that. And then there's also finally the training certification as individuals. So you can attend the training, and by attending the training and then soon by taking the test in the CDMC, you'll be able to be certified as an individual in the framework.
Good. Hey, Joubert, thank you very much for shedding light on that. And there's I think a where do you start kind of question. So Puneet, you're at a busy company, lots of things going on. Cloud and cloud enablement is a really critical topic for Citi and other organizations. So what's your take, having seen the framework, where do you apply this and where do you get going? What's your take on how this might bring value into the process? And also, where do you start?
Mike, that's a great question, and I think given all of these different capabilities and sub-capabilities are vital to the development of a good cloud-enabled solutions, my view is very much to identify a specific domain or a subdomain within the business where we could apply the CDMC framework holistically across all of the different sub-capabilities, and also implementing the controls and the automation that's a part of the framework. Identifying it by function or by subdomain really gives us an opportunity to experience the framework, bring together different components of it, and then create a sort of repeatable prototype or repeatable design pattern that can be applied to the wider data domains, etc. There's definitely a very, very keen desire to automate and codify some of the data controls, both from a classification perspective, from accessibility control perspective, from cross-border data clearance perspective, etc. And I think that's where really the automation and the control codification comes into play, which I think is really essential for the bank or financial services based solutions to be successful in the cloud environment.
Puneet, listening to your response, especially at the beginning, you made a statement that it would be important to define a segment of the business and then apply the full framework to that segment, as opposed to chopping up the framework into a piece and trying to apply that piece across. What made you, or what's your take on why all of the framework needs to be applied as opposed to pieces of it? What is the concept in your mind around that being an important approach?
I think, again, the coverage of the capabilities is really essential for cloud-based solutions.
Right.
We cannot underestimate the governance and the control aspect of cloud solutions, where you need data stewards and the data focused roles to own the definition of the data and to own the lifecycle management of the data. And really following up from the accountability capability are the other capabilities around cataloging, around lifecycle management, and around the other aspects of CDMC. So if we leave out one capability and focus too much on the other one, I think the chances of them coming together as a good solution are minimal in my mind. So I would like to limit the scope where we apply it and then apply it holistically.
Yeah.
All the parties are satisfied.
Absolutely. I was going to say another person who can comment about the implications at the institution, Andrew, you've listened into Puneet's response. You're familiar with the framework. Does that make sense? And any other thoughts you would like to share with the audience on where to start and where to apply it? I mean, everyone's obviously always worried about boiling the ocean. And business cases have to be going and so forth. What are your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, so two things. First of all, completely agree with Puneet on select your area to start with. That's more of a organization by organization question, but generally in large financial institutions, if you try one size fits all at the very beginning and apply everything everywhere, it doesn't necessarily go that well. So that's probably first of all. And then apart from that, the phrase I commonly use in a range of topics is justify your deviation from the norm. So, and what I'd say with that, to me, if CDMC goes the way we think it will, and the trajectory shows at the moment, it becomes the norm. So then how do you get your organization, if you're not following along those guidelines, sort of justify that deviation? Because in an optimal case, something's been spotted that wasn't captured, in which case feed it back in. We talk about annual recertifications and so on. Feed it back in, strengthen the industry framework. And if you're doing something that is just different, you really need to sort of question why. What makes you that special? Maybe in some cases you are special. You're a different industry or something else. But a lot of the time, I think the benefits from a cost perspective, a standardization perspective, it benefits each institution to really follow that path.
That's sound advice, Andrew. Chris, you have that benefit of seeing the perspective of multiple clients at Capco. And of course, there's that key ingredient that anytime you want to do anything, keep your eye on the business case and to getting the right sponsorship. What's your take on where to start with CDMC? What advice would you give this audience as they look across their enterprise, and what qualifications would you think need to be applied to give you the best footing for your start?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think first and foremost, business cases can be challenging to write. And I think too many people limit the business case to a cost play. And I think people have to realize that that's not really the game we're playing here. We're playing two games. We're playing a fundamental change to business, but we are playing a very fundamental risk profile change. And the CDMC is a big part of managing that. So you've really got to understand all the dimensions to a business case. It's not just about moving to the cloud, lowering storage costs, more compute. That's not the case. If you do that without well-managed data, one, that won't be achievable. And two, it adds a risk profile dimension that just didn't exist on-prem. So that has to be a really big part of this. I always say, you've got to start with the data. You can't start with the process. You've got to start with the data. Now, that's a bit of a funny thing of saying it, because I do agree with Punit and I agree with Andrew. You've got to start with the scope, but you've got to start with the data. This is all about putting good quality stuff into the hopper, and good quality comes out. If you focus on the well-governed parts of CDMC around data discovery and really get that bit right, tagging and classification, all the other stuff starts coming. What you can't do is try and jump to the end of it and some of the risk mitigation controls if you've not got that bit right. So I agree with Andrew and Punit. I would just probably argue that I would lead with that discovery. And if I was any organization, I would look at that as a utility service. That's something which should be pulled out of everyone's solution and done centrally once. And that's how I would probably look to tackle. You get that right, you get a really good pipeline for data migration into the cloud. Then you can start onboarding use cases. And then most importantly, if anyone talks about cloud as a cost save, you've got to first of all tell them that they're totally missing the point, and put them straight back on here that this is so much more than cost. Like all these things that people want to achieve will not be done if we don't get the data right. And worst case scenario, ethics, privacy, localization, all the other data risk types will explode in the cloud if we don't manage them properly. So I would really encourage people to talk about the whole set of dynamics around cloud and the whole business case, and don't play into the cost game. Anyone who talks that game doesn't understand what they're talking about.
Yeah,
to be blunt.
Chris, I'm also hearing you give a very fundamental piece of advice, that the basics of catalog, classification, discovery of data, those foundational pieces must be central at the beginning. Because if you don't do that right and you don't discover any data that's being brought into cloud, you're taking a fundamental risk, and nor can you enable any of the other more sophisticated controls that are covered in CDMC. So I'm almost hearing that that's a beginning area to focus on, in addition to Punit and Andrew's advice of pick a part of the business that would derive the most value, as opposed to trying to do everything simultaneously, because you will need to get support and adoption across the organization. This is very sound advice. Does anyone else want to jump in, Joubert, Russell, on this topic of where to start? What are the foundational pieces in the business case? Feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, I think a lot of those points are exactly right. We have around 1,600 customers with Azure Purview at the moment, and they range from very mature organizations that know very much where the biggest bang for buck will be by targeting, some of these new capabilities at business units that might need the most automation support or most help move into cloud because they have sensitive data types, to those that are starting out on the journey for the very first time and know they need to meet certain challenges around privacy or security, and they know that they need to start doing that quite quickly. So they scramble a little bit. And I definitely echo Chris's point. In fact, I put down when we were building the CDMC, there was a clear set of top line fundamental capabilities within the CDMC, and cataloging and classification, Mike, as you mentioned, effectively gather all of the metadata needed to start building that what we call control plane that will allow you to do the rest of the CDMC. So, from a Microsoft perspective, we very much put cataloging, classification, data security, and data ownership in the foundation of what we advise customers to start with. And then, how you break that down by business line, there are those greenfield projects that are starting new and have their new shiny architectures in the cloud and are good candidates to start working with these new technologies and start scanning and building that metadata fabric and then expanding the complexity of what you can achieve with it using the CDMC. But as you say, it all starts from the basics of gather your metadata and use some of that automated scanning capability.
And Mike, just to back Chris up there, I would say it's no longer, my personal view, no longer a cost conversation at all. It's about capability and it's about scale. So it's new capabilities and scale larger than we've seen before. I think the cost conversation sort of stopped maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, is it safe to say there's enough proof in the market that there are cost benefits if done well? Now it's how do we scale in a way that allows us not to take reputational risk or other forms of data risk. So if you get these foundational pieces in place and have them validated and automated, there's now a chance to really scale up faster with more confidence and more trust. Is that essentially what I'm hearing you say?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, good. So there is a question here. I will let our panelists jump in on this one. A couple of questions about the relationship. Michael raised this as one of our audience members. What is the relationship between DCAM and CDMC? Will the two capability models be interrelated in the future? There's another question from Prashant. How do the DCAM and CDMC frameworks interact? Is there a view on the ideal sequence to follow? Who would like to jump in? I certainly might have an opinion, but I don't want to outspeak my panelists at this point. So who would like to jump in on either of those questions? They're very close to each other.
I mean, maybe I can jump. Oh, sorry, no, you go first, mate.
Go for it.
No, I was just going to say just from the at the coalface working on data governance in the cloud, what I can say is the approach that was followed was don't duplicate what's in DCAM, right? So taking what we're delivering for CDMC and it's sort of supplemental to DCAM and focused on cloud, but without duplication. I think how that relationship works in the future, yeah, best up to Mike or someone else to answer.
I mean, I was actually going to say the way we look at using our clients is fundamentally different because I think ultimately they are highly connected, but the point of them is quite different. So when we look at DCAM, we're looking at the broader data capabilities around governance management, around an organization policy framework, or broader around data ownership and accountability. CDMC is very focused on how do you take those without duplication and point those to designing and building a cloud framework. Now they are actually connected. And I think the two of them work well together because actually you need them both to have full coverage if you want to do the full data piece. Obviously, you can use them independently, but in my mind, we would use them in different ways. Clients for different kinds of problems. One from a more broader data governance, how we're controlling data versus how we're setting up our cloud infrastructure, right, control framework, governance. And let's be clear, the CDMC does cover the governance bit, but it covers it from a cloud perspective. But that isn't all data and organization. So you kind of do need the both of them there. That's how we look at it and talk about it with our clients anyway.
Yeah, and Chris and Andrew, thanks for that perspective. Also, to be clear, these are two independent frameworks. And it depends, as you mentioned, Chris and Andrew, on what your focus is and what your business driver is. If your data programs are up and running, you've evaluated your maturity and basic core governance and those across on-prem, cloud, et cetera, generally operating, but you're truly looking to scale up faster your public cloud offerings that you're leveraging, and you have more than one, then absolutely CDMC might be something you can immediately use to have confidence in doing that. And conversely, if you're newer in that data management journey or the business unit you're in is at an earlier stage of just getting the basics of core data management up and running, independent of cloud or on-prem, then DCAM might be the thing you start with first. So we're careful, I think, in this to not dictate what the right answer is, but that each company can evaluate this for what makes sense to their journey and what their business priorities are. one important tool that we're making available is a digital mapping that companies can visit on the EDM Council website, where we've cross-referenced digitally using a platform that's been donated by one of the partners called Solidatus. So you can actually see the capabilities in DCAM and how they digitally map to the CDMC and vice versa. And the benefit of that is if you're going to be looking at both frameworks, you can see how they interrelate at the finest level of granularity. And number two, if you do want to do an assessment for one or both frameworks, you can have the opportunity to take certain deliverables and artifacts and share them across the two frameworks so that you're most efficient in doing that. And that's a topic, if you want to learn more about it, you can certainly speak to the Capco team or visit the council website. We'll help with that. So these have all been really good questions, and we're approaching towards the end. I'm just glancing through on the different questions that have been put in by our panelists. There is one that's been brought up, and this is from someone who said, is there anyone driving and providing a Canadian perspective on alignment to regulations here? And just a quick answer, and if anyone else wants to add in on it, the answer is several of the large Canadian financial institutions participated in the build out of the framework, which is great. So we had ground level participation from the beginning. And then OSFI is one of the Canadian regulators that have had a couple of briefings on the framework. And something I just need to be clear about at this is that everyone here has been speaking with their own opinions, not necessarily representing all of their companies. But what I can share with you is that regulators will never endorse a framework. They may attend a training class, they may have their arms of the organization be involved, or they can download the framework. Our expectation is the best indicator is that it's referenced by regulators in their businesses, and something that is financial institutions present their evidence that they have a framework and they are following this type of guidance. It creates more confidence. So that's not a guarantee that they're not going to ask more questions, but it should evidence to the regulator that someone is very serious about protecting sensitive data if they're leveraging this industry-built framework. So I guess we're towards the end at this point for some closing remarks. Before I ask for those, are there any other comments that my panelists and our panelists today would like to raise? I'll just let you open up your microphone. So, and then if not, I will open it up to the closing remarks. But any other comments or thoughts before we start the wrap up? Okay, so Puneet, if you're good, do you mind kicking off sort of as our audience heads back into their business? Any final thoughts for them that you'd like to share from today?
Sure, Mike. I would just like to reiterate the point made earlier. You know, the usability and the value of the framework is as much as it is used, and there's a definitive network effect to this framework. If we can encourage our partners, cloud providers, integrators, etc., to start adapting the framework, I think all of our journey to the cloud would be a lot smoother, and we'll have a common sort of standard in the framework. So I'm starting to do that.
Puneet, hear to that. Absolutely. And I guess now over to Andrew. Andrew, your closing thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I don't think anything over and above what I said earlier, but maybe just an offer. You know, if someone's listening to this and would like to reach out one-to-one, sort of reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Yep.
Always happy to have a conversation about any aspect of it.
Andrew, thank you for making that offer, and that's meaningful. You've been highly involved in this, so I think you would add a lot of value to that discussion, and thank you for making that offer to the audience. Jubair, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you know, Microsoft are taking this very seriously, and I think it's definitely a reflection of how much work went into this by some fantastic voluntary time, as you mentioned, Mike. I just want to say thank you to everyone that was involved in the year and a half it took to develop this. And there's also going to be more opportunities to stay involved as well. We'll be doing a cross-industry task force. There will be a DCAM and CDMC alignment exercise at some point. So, you know, there is more opportunity to stay involved. So please do. Yeah,
and Jubair, thank you for sharing that. This isn't a one and done exercise, though we have a phenomenal start with the 1.1 release. There are more things happening. Everything is continuing to evolve. and we're going to have an active governance model kicking off with governance meetings starting in January. If you'd like to get involved, simply visit the council website or reach out to any of the panelists or certainly the Capco team, and we'd be happy to have you involved. So, hey, Chris, thank you again from the EDM Council, and thank you to all of our panelists today, and thank you for being a sponsor for getting out the good word about CDMC. I turn the mic over to you for some final comments, and then I'll cover some housekeeping for our audience members.
I mean, for me, the only 2 points I would really focus on is one, I can't agree more that this is only going to work if people engage with it, feedback to it, engage in conversations. That isn't just with the EDMC, actually. That is with their regulators, with their internal senior management, with their vendors. You know, the more we talk about this, the better, and the more we feedback. There is obviously going to be bits in this which need tweaking along the way. So I think if everyone goes into this with this kind of iterative mindset, and I think as Mike says, version 1.1.1 is actually a really, it's a huge milestone for the industry. And then second of all, you know, I would really start with the data I said earlier on. You've got to get the data pieces right here. So if you focus on that, the discovery, anyone looking at their cloud journeys who is not thinking about how they are registering and classifying data as they go into the cloud, and they're lifting and shifting and trying to deal with it later, I think you're setting yourself up for some future problems. And if anyone want to talk to that, please do reach out to myself, Russell, or anyone in the Capco team as well to talk about that. But it's been an absolute pleasure for us to be involved with this. So back over to you, Mike.
Yeah, and Chris, thank you. And again, thank you to the Capco team for being exemplary and supporting CDMC throughout the process. We're really grateful for that contribution. So for our audience, you'll see on the screen, how do you access the CDMC? It is a free license. Just visit the edmcouncil.org website. You can quickly register and download it for your internal use. And there's more information there about courses and more if you have interest in learning about it. The other thing I wanted to do is thanks once again, all of our panelists. So Puneet, thank you very much. Jubair, thank you. Andrew, thank you. And Chris and Russell, thank you for helping provide all of the context. So here's some housekeeping for our audience. Within a few hours, you'll receive an automated email from the platform that'll be the full recording of this. Additionally, all the questions that were typed in, we will give a written response to along with the deck. That'll come within a day or two. So you'll actually end up getting 2 communications. And this way you'll have these to share with your colleagues and more. And on behalf of the EDM Council and the team today, thank you very much. If you'd like to learn more from Capco, please reach out to Chris. We're happy to have that happen. And we wish everyone a good day. Thank you for attending this webinar. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.